Hi, Rama. It's week 18, day 3 of our Bible narrative reading plan. We're continuing in our journey through the book of 1 Samuel. We are also supplemented today by reading Psalm 59. The inscription of Psalm 59 tells us the setting, the context. It reminds us that David has written that psalm in light of being pursued, being chased, being hunted by Saul. So read that psalm with that context in mind and let it shape you and form you as we read this story, 1 Samuel, and as we continue seeing David pursued and being hunted by Saul. Saul is openly hunting David. He's even involving his son Jonathan, but Jonathan chooses David over Saul, again showing that everyone in the story, whether wittingly or unwittingly, they are siding with God's anointed king, David, over the people's chosen king, Saul. And so Jonathan helps David escape, and then David's wife, Michal, that is Saul's daughter, David's wife, she helps him escape. Notice in there that she has an idol that she's using in this whole story, showing us that even in the house of the king of Israel is not, there's no absence of idolatry, there's no absence of syncretism, mixing of worldly religion and true religion, even in the house of the king. Michal has that idol, that image, and she uses it to help David escape. But then you get this interesting story. David flees to where Samuel is at. Samuel is at his home at Ramah. And so David goes to where Samuel is, and Saul hears about it. Saul sends henchmen to go and get David. 3 times Saul sends henchmen to go get David. And every time when those henchmen get there, they are overcome by the Spirit of God present there on Samuel and on David and the other prophets who are there. And those henchmen are overwhelmed by the Spirit of the Lord, and they begin prophesying. They begin praising God for who he is. And they can't take David. Even though that's their mission, that's why they're there, is to take David back to Saul. They can't do it. And so Saul continues this for 3 times. And never works, and eventually Saul himself goes to Ramah. He goes to where Samuel and David are. But when Saul gets to where Samuel and David are, even Saul himself can't help being overcome by the Spirit of the Lord. This is the last time that the Spirit of the Lord rests on Saul. Saul begins to prophesy as well. And a very interesting phrase or sentence there, verse 24, he too, that is Saul too, stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel and lay naked all that day and all that night. Thus it is said, is Saul also among the prophets. Now we saw that phrase earlier in 1 Samuel, and the previous time when Saul prophesied and it was asked, is Saul too among the prophets? This was showing his anointing as king. But now this is showing that he no longer has the anointing of God. Even as Saul went there to kill David, he can't help but be overwhelmed by the Spirit of God. He must praise and prophesy in the name of the Lord. But as he does that, he uncontrollably strips off his clothes because he's under the influence of the Spirit of God. And this is symbolic because even as his clothes are stripped away from him, so is the kingdom being stripped away from Saul. And again, we're going to keep seeing this process going on, but it's becoming very clear to everyone that Saul is not God's anointed king, even as he was the king of the people's choosing. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.